In a moment that sent shockwaves across America, Rick Harrison, once celebrated as the embodiment of trust, hard work, and the American dream, broke a silence that had weighed on him for decades. Inside the dim confines of a Las Vegas hospital room, his frail voice pierced through years of secrecy, unveiling a reality far darker than anyone could have foreseen. Under relentless pressure from a growing federal investigation and with overwhelming evidence closing in, Harrison finally chose to reveal the chilling truths he had carried in silence for years. With a voice strained to little more than a whisper and eyes heavy with regret, he confessed not only to his own role in hidden dealings, but inadvertently exposed a criminal network so vast and intricate that its very existence seemed beyond comprehension. Rick Harrison's confession didn't just jolt the entertainment industry. It shattered the public's image of the beloved television father figure, revealing a narrative so grim it demanded the world's attention. If this story moved you or struck a chord deep within, leave a 1 in the comments to show your empathy for Rick Harrison and the complex emotional journey he set into motion. If you feel differently, share your thoughts with a 0. And don't forget to like and share. Let the truth reach others, because this story is far from over. Rick Harrison once stood as a symbol of the American spirit. But behind the smiles, a darker story was waiting to be told. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at Sunrise Hospital and Medical Center in Las Vegas. Among the patients admitted that day was Rick Harrison, the familiar face from the television show Pawn Stars, who had been rushed in under critical condition. Severe dehydration, arrhythmia, and psychological stress had nearly claimed his life. Sylvester Stallone had been at the hospital for a different reason altogether. He had come quietly, avoiding the spotlight, to visit a longtime friend recovering from surgery. For Stallone, hospitals were places he preferred to avoid unless absolutely necessary. They reminded him of mortality, of battles fought and battles lost. As he walked past the intensive care wing, he heard it. A faint voice, strained and broken, bleeding into the otherwise sterile silence. Curious, he slowed down, and what he caught froze him in his tracks. The children, they were never meant to be cargo. Stallone turned sharply toward the room where the voice came from. Through a narrow opening in the door, he caught a glimpse of Rick Harrison, frail and pale, his body barely a shadow of the larger-than-life persona Americans had known for over a decade. His eyes were half open, staring into some distant, invisible place. At first, Stallone assumed it was delirium, the kind that often took hold in the ICU. But something about the way Rick said those words, not just the content, but the raw, desperate sorrow behind them, made it impossible to dismiss. Stallone stood there for a moment longer, wrestling with the urge to step inside. In his long career, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him that this wasn't something he could ignore. He knocked gently and pushed the door open. Rick's head shifted slightly toward him. Recognition flickered in his exhausted eyes, followed by a look of deep, soul-crushing shame. "Rick," Stallone said softly, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "You know who I am?" Rick gave a weak nod. His lips trembled as if trying to form words, but the effort was overwhelming. Stallone leaned in closer. "You said something about children, about cargo. What did you mean?" For a moment, Rick just stared at him, the seconds stretching thin. Then, in a whisper so soft Stallone had to strain to hear it, Rick replied, "I made mistakes. Big ones. Trusted the wrong people. Looked the other way. And now it's too late. The old fighter in Stallone bristled. He had faced villains on screen and in life, but hearing Rick's voice crack under the weight of regret struck something deeper, something he hadn't expected. This wasn't just the confession of a guilty man. It was the confession of a broken one. "What happened, Rick?" Stallone pressed gently. Rick's eyelids fluttered. His chest heaved with shallow breaths. It started with shipments, deals. Nothing seemed wrong at first. Antiquities, old maps, restoration equipment. That's what they said. Stallone listened in grim silence. But then some shipments. They didn't make sense. No manifests, no inspections, special handling. And the men behind them, they didn't want questions. When I pushed, they pushed back. Hard. Rick coughed, a rattling sound that shook his entire body. A nurse peeked in, but saw Stallone wave her off with a slight nod. Rick struggled to continue. "I found out too late. I wasn't moving antiques. I was moving people. Kids. God help me." The words hit Stallone like a punch to the gut. Rick turned his head, fixing Stallone with a desperate gaze. "I tried to stop it. Tried to walk away. But by then, they owned too much. Knew too much." For a long moment, Stallone just sat there, absorbing the enormity of what he was hearing. He had seen corruption in Hollywood, greed in the business world. But this was something darker, more horrifying than anything he could have imagined. "Is there proof?" Stallone asked quietly. Rick's eyes fluttered shut, then open again. "They have everything hidden. Accounts, islands, codes. I left something, just in case, in the office, behind the safe. They don't know about it." "Where?" Stallone demanded gently. Rick's lips barely moved. "Palm Desert, old storage room, red binder, top shelf, under the old globe." Stallone committed the instructions to memory. Rick's hand trembled as he reached for Stallone's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Please," Rick rasped, "not just for me, for them." Stallone squeezed his hand in silent promise. Within minutes, the monitors beeped frantically. Nurses rushed in. Stallone was ushered out as Rick's condition worsened. Through the small window in the door, he watched the team work feverishly to stabilize the man whose whispered confession could shatter lives and reputations. Driving back toward his hotel, Stallone couldn't shake the haunted look in Rick's eyes. He replayed every word in his mind, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his broad shoulders. If what Rick said was true, and deep down Stallone believed it was, there were children, real children, who needed saving. The next morning, he made the call. Tommy Rizzo, a retired NYPD detective turned private investigator, was the first on his list. They had met years ago when Stallone had done charity work for the Police Benevolent Association in New York. Tommy answered on the second ring. "Yo, Sly, what's up? Everything all right?" "No," Stallone said simply. "I need your help." Quietly. Tommy didn't ask questions. He just said, "Where and when?" By noon, they were headed toward Palm Desert, California, the heat shimmering off the asphalt as they drove in an unmarked black SUV. Stallone explained only the basics. Rick Harrison had confessed something massive, something involving missing children and illegal shipments masked as antique deals. When they reached the dusty strip mall where Rick had apparently kept an old office hidden from public knowledge, Stallone felt his pulse quicken. It was an unimposing building, sandwiched between a vacant laundromat and a pawn shop ironically named Desert Gold. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and disuse. The office was sparse: a battered desk, a cracked leather sofa, and filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. They found the safe behind a framed painting of a Nevada landscape. It took Tommy less than 3 minutes to crack it open, working with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long years on the force. Inside, stacked carefully, was an old red binder, exactly where Rick said it would be, and tucked under it a battered globe, its faded oceans spinning loosely on a rusted axis. Tommy flipped the binder open. Inside were documents, photographs, shipping manifests, and codes. Real, tangible evidence. Stallone turned a page and felt his stomach lurch. Photographs of children. Handwritten notes in code beside them. Shipping routes connecting Las Vegas, Miami, San Juan, and remote islands in the Caribbean. "This is bad," Tommy muttered. "This is really bad." Stallone's jaw tightened. "It's worse than bad. This is evil." He knew now, beyond any doubt, that Rick Harrison's confession wasn't just the ramblings of a man in pain. It was the truth, and it had to come out. He had no ideas yet just how deep the rabbit hole would go. Stallone and Tommy drove back toward Las Vegas, under the fading amber light of the desert. The binder sat between them, almost humming with the weight of its terrible contents. Neither man spoke much. There was an unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't just about Rick anymore. It was about the children, the silent victims, hidden behind smiling television faces and gleaming showrooms. Stallone's mind raced as the city lights of Vegas came back into view, neon and glitter masking the rot beneath. They couldn't go straight to the police. Not yet. Whoever had orchestrated this had influence, and Stallone knew from experience how fast evidence could disappear when the wrong people were tipped off. Instead, they headed for the home of Johnny Wexler, a longtime friend and investigative journalist who had spent decades exposing corruption at every level, from city halls to Washington corridors. Johnny lived in a modest, worn house off Charleston Boulevard, far from the casinos and the spectacle. He opened the door wearing a wrinkled T-shirt, glasses perched precariously on his nose. His face, lined with years of chasing dangerous stories, lit up in surprise. "Sly, what the hell brings you here?" Stallone didn't waste time. Within minutes, the binder was spread out on Johnny's kitchen table, the 3 men huddled over its contents. As Johnny flipped through the photos, the coded messages, and the shipping logs, his expression shifted from curiosity to horror. "My God," he whispered, glancing up at Stallone. "This is huge. This is bigger than anything I've ever seen." Stallone nodded grimly. "It has to get out, Johnny, but we need to do it right. No leaks, no screw-ups. Lives are on the line." Johnny tapped his fingers against the table, thinking, "I can assemble a team. People I trust. Editors who aren't bought and paid for. We'll document everything. Build the case airtight. Then we go public." Stallone leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time since Rick's confession, he felt a flicker of hope. They had a plan. They had proof. But hope, he knew, was fragile in a world where money and power could twist justice into unrecognizable shapes. Over the next 48 hours, Johnny's small but fierce team worked tirelessly. They cross-referenced shipping manifests with missing persons reports, traced wire transfers through shell companies registered in the Virgin Islands and Panama, and identified suspicious purchases of remote properties across the Caribbean. Stallone stayed in the background, lending his name only when absolutely necessary to open doors or bypass red tape. He knew his celebrity was a double-edged sword. It could draw attention, but also risked tipping off the wrong people. Meanwhile, Rick's condition worsened. News leaked that the beloved Pawn Stars figure was in critical care, setting off a media frenzy. Speculation swirled: health scare, stress collapse, old age catching up. But no one outside their small circle knew the real storm brewing beneath the surface. On the third night, as Stallone sat alone in his hotel room, his phone buzzed. It was Tommy. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "I think someone's on to us." Stallone's heart sank. Tommy explained that, earlier that evening, he had spotted two unfamiliar SUVs circling Johnny's neighborhood, their windows heavily tinted. Later, someone had tried to break into Johnny's house. Fortunately, the reinforced locks held, but it was a clear warning. Whoever was behind the trafficking network had realized that pieces of the puzzle were slipping out of their grasp. Stallone paced the room, mind racing. They had to move faster. They couldn't wait for the perfect exposé, the carefully crafted article. They needed to strike while they still could. The next morning, under the blazing Nevada sun, Stallone made a decision. They would hold a press conference. Public pressure could shield them where quiet investigations could not. Johnny made the calls. Within hours, a modest conference room at the Four Queens Hotel was secured. Not flashy, not extravagant, just enough space for trusted journalists who would report the truth. Stallone, Tommy, Johnny, and two young investigators from Johnny's team arrived early to set up. They displayed copies of the documents, photographs, and a timeline of events stretching across a whiteboard. It wasn't sleek, but it was real, and it was damning. As the room filled with murmuring reporters and flashing cameras, Stallone stepped to the podium. He didn't wear a suit or any Hollywood costume, just jeans and a plain black t-shirt, the way most Americans had come to know and love him over the years. He let the room settle before he spoke. "My name is Sylvester Stallone," he said, voice steady, "and I'm not here as an actor today. I'm here as an American. I'm here because sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything." He paused, feeling the weight of the moment press against his chest. 3 days ago, Rick Harrison, a man many of you know from television, confessed from his hospital bed that he had knowledge of a human trafficking operation operating right under our noses. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't rumor. He left behind evidence, shipping records, financial trails, photographs that tied together a network of exploitation hidden behind legitimate businesses. The reporters leaned in, pens scratching furiously, cameras flashing like a heartbeat. "We have that evidence here today. You're going to see it, and when you do, you'll understand why we couldn't stay silent." Stallone gestured to Johnny, who began distributing packets of documents to the press. The room buzzed as journalists flipped through the damning proof. Some gasped audibly, others simply sat, stunned. Stallone continued, his voice firm. "This isn't just about one man. It's about a system, about power shielding evil from consequence, and about innocent lives caught in the crossfire." Questions erupted. Why trust Rick Harrison? Couldn't this be a setup? Who else is involved? What about law enforcement? Have you contacted the FBI? Stallone fielded them calmly, stating that the evidence had already been submitted to federal authorities and that investigations were underway. He emphasized that Rick had admitted his own guilt and sought redemption in his final days. "He wasn't trying to save himself," Stallone said. "He was trying to save the ones who couldn't speak for themselves. As the conference ended, the coverage spread like wildfire. National news outlets picked up the story within hours. CNN, NBC, Fox. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #Save the Children and #Rick Confession trending nationwide. Protesters gathered outside pawn shops across the country, demanding answers. Politicians weighed in, some calling for sweeping reforms in international shipping regulations and child protection laws. Yet, even as the public demanded justice, Stallone knew the battle was far from over. That night, as he sat on the balcony of his hotel room, overlooking the glittering city that never truly slept, he reflected on how quickly the world had shifted. 3 days ago, he had been another aging actor visiting a sick friend. Now, he was part of a fight that stretched beyond anything he had ever trained for, beyond any script he had ever memorized. Somewhere deep in the shimmering neon sprawl of Las Vegas, others were plotting, scrambling to cover their tracks, or preparing to strike back. Stallone tightened his grip on the balcony railing, the desert wind cold against his skin. He wasn't naive. Retaliation would come. It always did when the powerful felt cornered, but he was ready. For the first time in years, he felt the fire in his veins that had carried him through so many battles, on screen and off. He wasn't fighting for a role or a paycheck. He was fighting for something real, for children who had been lost, stolen, erased, for the truth. He looked up at the endless stars above the Nevada desert and made himself a promise. He would see this through, no matter how long it took, no matter how high the cost. He owed it to Rick. He owed it to those kids. He owed it to the soul of a country he still believed in, battered and flawed though it was. The real fight was just beginning. 2 days after the press conference, the first federal raids took place. Quiet, methodical, and unannounced, they targeted shipping warehouses in Henderson, Phoenix, and Miami, locations Stallone and Johnny's team had traced through Rick's binder. What they found confirmed every nightmare suspicion. Hidden compartments in shipping containers, forged documents, and evidence of routes leading to private airstrips in the Caribbean. Stallone received the updates through encrypted channels Johnny had set up with trusted federal agents. Each new report hit him like a hammer. It wasn't just Rick's world that was built on lies. It was an entire network spanning oceans and continents, cloaked in respectability and commerce. More names surfaced, some familiar from society pages and political fundraisers. Stallone felt a cold anger settle into his bones. He thought he had seen enough of the world's dark side over the decades. He had been wrong. One evening, a quiet knock came at Stallone's suite. Tommy entered, his face more serious than usual. In his hand, he held a flash drive. "You need to see this," Tommy said simply. They plugged it into Johnny's laptop. Video files loaded. Grainy footage taken from inside one of the shipping containers. Children, huddled together, scared, silent, some barely old enough to speak. A lump rose in Stallone's throat. The footage wasn't just evidence. It was a searing testament to cruelty hidden in plain sight. "These are from last year," Tommy said, voice rough. "How many more are out there?" Stallone stared at the screen, fists clenching. "Too many," he whispered. The videos provided the final push needed. Congress members called for emergency hearings. The FBI launched a special task force. The Department of Homeland Security pledged full cooperation. America, for the first time in a long time, was paying attention not to celebrity scandals or petty politics, but to something real, something that demanded action. Rick Harrison passed away quietly 3 days later. The official cause listed complications from cardiac arrest. There was no statement from his family, no funeral broadcasted on TMZ, only a quiet press release thanking fans for their support. Stallone didn't attend any public memorial. Instead, he went back to Sunrise Hospital one last time, standing alone outside the ICU where Rick had whispered the truth that changed everything. He muttered a few words under his breath, a simple promise that justice would not be denied. Then he left, stepping back into the firestorm. Rick's confession had ignited. As federal agents expanded their investigation, the web continued to unravel. Shell companies collapsed one after another under forensic accounting scrutiny. Subpoenas flew. High-profile resignations filled the news. Some tried to deny involvement. Others fled overseas. A few were quietly arrested, their mugshots leaked to the press. Through it all, Stallone remained involved, not as a star seeking the limelight, but as a witness, a protector of the truth. He testified before Congress in a closed session, his gravelly voice steady, as he recounted Rick's confession and the evidence they had uncovered. Reporters camped outside his house. Tabloids speculated wildly. Some accused him of grandstanding. Others hailed him as a hero. Stallone ignored them all. He wasn't interested in fame. He had enough of that. He wanted something far more precious: accountability. Meanwhile, Johnny Wexler's expose series exploded across every major media outlet. Titled Shadows Beneath the Neon, it documented the rise and fall of a system built on greed and hidden behind Americana charm. Johnny didn't pull punches. He named names, he traced money, he showed faces, and he never once allowed the story to drift into sensationalism. Every paragraph was built on evidence, every accusation backed by irrefutable proof. The series won awards, but Johnny brushed them off. He said the only prize he wanted was to see real change. 6 months after the first raids, President Cartwright signed into law the Child Protection and Anti-Trafficking Act of 2025, dramatically increasing oversight of private shipping routes and strengthening penalties for trafficking-related crimes. Stallone was invited to the signing ceremony at the White House. He stood quietly in the background, hands clasped behind his back, watching as the president's pen scratched across the page. A small, bittersweet smile crossed his face. It was a victory, but it had come at a terrible cost. Too many lives had been lost or shattered before America had finally opened its eyes. Later that evening, Stallone returned to Los Angeles. As his car weaved through the city he had once ruled as a young star, he reflected on everything that had happened. In some ways, nothing had changed. The city still pulsed with ambition and artifice. Dreams were still bought and sold under bright lights. But somewhere, deep in the machinery, a small part had been broken, exposed, forced into reckoning. Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe it was just a beginning. But beginnings mattered. One evening, a package arrived at Stallone's house. No return address. Inside was an envelope containing a simple photograph. It showed a group of children standing outside a bright yellow school bus, smiling shyly at the camera. On the back, in a careful hand, someone had written, "Thank you." Stallone sat down heavily, the photo trembling slightly in his hand. They weren't just statistics anymore. They weren't headlines or hashtags. They were children, real and breathing, who had a second chance because Rick Harrison, in his final moments, chose truth over silence, and because Stallone had listened. Weeks passed. The headlines moved on to other scandals, other outrages. But for Stallone, the echoes of the desert, of whispered confessions and hidden evils, never quite faded. He stayed involved quietly, funding shelters, advocating for survivors, pushing lawmakers for stricter regulations. Not because he sought redemption. He hadn't been the one who sinned. But because when you know the truth, you carry a duty heavier than any role, heavier than any fame. He often thought about Rick, a man who had built an empire out of relics and memories, who had entertained millions with his wit and knowledge, but who had also, knowingly or unknowingly, let darkness seep into the cracks of his life. Rick had made unforgivable mistakes, but in the end, he had done one thing right. And sometimes, Stallone thought, one right thing could tip the scales. One rainy morning in November, Stallone visited the small plaque newly installed at a park in Henderson. It didn't bear Rick Harrison's name. It bore the names of 38 children who had been rescued thanks to the investigation. Stallone stood there for a long time, the rain soaking into his jacket, reading each name aloud in a low voice, honoring them in the only way he knew how. When he finished, he placed a simple bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the plaque. No cameras, no speeches, just silence, and the relentless, beautiful beating of the human heart refusing to forget. As he walked back to his car, Stallone glanced over his shoulder one last time. In the distance, a few children were laughing, playing under the gray sky, their voices bright against the somber morning. He smiled, a real smile, small but unbreakable. In a world built on forgetting, he had chosen to remember. And in doing so, he had helped carve out a tiny, defiant corner of hope. It wasn't enough. It never would be. But it was a start.